everyone. Welcome back to She Boys Podcast. Today's guest is Lisa. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Brooke. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being a guest today. So before we went to record, we was talking a little bit about Alzheimer's and dementia. So can you give our listeners like a brief definition of both so they know the difference between them?
I surely can. And it's a great question because a lot of people actually do believe that Alzheimer's disease and dementia are two separate diseases, and they're not.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. Alzheimer's is a brain disease, and it's one of many, many, many brain diseases. There are over 100 that cause dementia. So
wow.
Dementia is a syndrome. And when people use the term dementia, they're really referring to all of the symptoms and the signs and the behaviors that accompany one of these brain diseases. Now, the most common one that most of us know about is Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of a case where Alzheimer's disease doesn't cause dementia. But there are several diseases out there like Parkinson's disease, where most of us are familiar with Michael J. Fox, and he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease probably about 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. He has Parkinson's, which is a brain disease, but he doesn't have the dementia with it. So some people actually do develop Parkinson's disease and they get the dementia, which means they have the changing brain, the damage being done to the brain, all the signs and symptoms. And there are so many of those too. There's over 100 of those. So we kind of just put it all in a bucket and call it dementia. But what it's really doing is referring to all the symptoms that go along with a brain disease. So there's lots of different dementias. There's lots of different brain diseases. But again, brain disease causes dementia. It's not a separate illness.
Wow, I did not know that at all. Like I thought they were separate.
It's very interesting. People are, and I was surprised first time I heard it too, because it's kind of a natural assumption to think that you're talking about two different things, but it's really not. It's kind of like when you're talking about the flu. Yeah. And you're describing to somebody how you feel. Oh, I have body aches and a fever and chills. Well, you're talking about the symptoms of the flu.
Right.
Not the flu. Flu is the virus. So when you're talking about dementia, you're actually referring to all of the symptoms that go along with that brain disease. So the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is memory loss and confusion. But it is so much more complicated than that, because people who have Alzheimer's disease display many, 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 many symptoms and behaviors like hallucinations and paranoia and delusions and agitation. This is all part of what we're putting into that dementia bucket.
That's true. And like before we came to record, I was telling you a little bit about my aunt who has that. And you're right. She hallucinates and she thinks people are out to get her. And she's like going, I wouldn't say crazy, but she's going like accusing people of stuff. And I'm like, kind of scary. I've never witnessed it myself because I don't know how to handle it. So I'm like, I don't know if I want to be around, but I'm kind of scared, but I don't know. But so can you tell us what inspired you to write your books? Like, did you have a family member that went through this or is going through this?
I've had 8.
8? Wow.
Yes. Oh, wow. 5 of those 8 are blood relatives on my mother's side. And the other 3 were through marriage. So I've had a mother-in-law and a brother-in-law, and they've all suffered from different brain diseases that cause dementia. And my inspiration, to answer your question, was my grandmother, who developed an Alzheimer's type disease. And this is, going on almost 50 years. And she started displaying some very strange behaviors and telling some very bizarre stories. You know, I was a teenager and I'd go over to her house. We didn't live very far from one another. And she would start talking about these birds that lived in her mattress, and they would come out at night and peck at her face. And then, like you said about your aunt, or your mom's aunt, that she believed that people were trying to break into her house to harm her. And she was always telling me about this person stole this and that person stole that from her. And then she'd tell me about the rats that ran along the walls. These are all hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia that is actually very common with the disease. And then I ended up going into this profession. I've been working as a professional behavioral specialist for over 26 years. And I think that the experience that I had with my grandmother just really had a huge impact on my life. And the way she was treated at that time. She was calling the police. She was living home alone. She was calling the police 3 or 4 times a day, reporting all these things that I just told y'all. And they got a hold of my mother one day, and they went over to her house and they said, "You need to do something with her. That woman is a nut. And we don't have the resources to keep answering all these calls." And they didn't understand. Back then they called it senile dementia, but that's synonymous with Alzheimer's disease today. And they just didn't understand it, let alone know how to deal with it. So when they called my grandmother a nut, and I knew she was anything but a nut, that really stuck in my craw. And unfortunately, the attitude and the paradigm around Alzheimer's disease and some of these other brain diseases that cause dementia, they haven't changed that dramatically in the last 45 years. People still don't understand the disease.
At all. And I love it that I'm having this conversation with you, because it's educating me more on about my aunt, what she's going through. Because I'm not gonna lie to you, before this interview, I was scared of her, like going around her, because I've never been around someone that's going through that.
Well, you make a really good point, Brooke, because the main reason why family members, friends kind of avoid visiting their relatives who have dementia is because it's so uncomfortable and it's so awkward and it's very intimidating. You never know what they're going to say or what they're going to do, what they're going to accuse you of. But there's a lot of ways to handle those situations that actually will diffuse the situation if you just know the effective way to respond to those types of things. Like, a funny story when my grandmother was telling me that these birds lived in her mattress and they would come out at night and peck at her face. And I thought that was probably one of the most outlandish things I'd ever heard, but I wanted to believe her. Plus, she was very convincing. So I went and I pushed her mattress up one day and I said, "Grandma, look." I said, "There's no holes in your mattress. I don't see a thing. There's no birds. What are you talking about?" And her response was so classic. She said, "Oh, they're there, but they're very clever." And that was her response.
Wow.
I figured out how to work around me doubting her. So it's very common too. That's very common.
Wow. Like, I don't know what to say. Like, wow. I don't know how I would be able to handle it. Wow. You handle it very well. You and my mom. And y'all both have the same name. You and my mom have the same name. But I wanted to go into a little bit more about your books. So you have 2 books, and I want to talk about the first one, the Not All Who Wonder Need Be Lost. Can you give our listeners like a brief summary of that book? And I know what already inspired it, but a brief summary of it.
Yes, it's a compilation of true stories over my 20s, well, actually, since my grandmother, so spanning 40 years of experience working in the field as a professional and my own family's experience. So it's a compilation of true stories that illustrates at least one or more of the common behaviors that show up as a result of brain disease.
Mhm.
So my grandmother's story illustrates the behaviors of paranoia and delusions and hallucinations. And then it's got a further thoughts section, which kind of expands on kind of how to handle that. So there's every story depicts one of these behaviors or more than one of these behaviors. So people will be able to learn to recognize what behaviors accompany brain diseases and also learn how to respond to them effectively. And interestingly enough, the responses and the reactions that we as the caregivers or the loved ones should demonstrate are counterintuitive to the way that we instinctively want to react. And I'll give you an example. It's very common, and there's a story in the book about this where a woman whose husband had passed away 4 or 5 years earlier jumped up out of her chair one day and said, "Oh, somebody needs to take me home. My husband's waiting for me. He'll be expecting me home to fix some dinner." She did not remember that he was deceased. Now, our gut reaction would be to correct that person, and because we want to fix that person, especially if we're related to him, if we're a daughter or a granddaughter. And we'll say, "Oh, Mom, don't you remember? Dad died 5 years ago. What are you talking about?" That's not the best approach. And I teach people what the best approach is. And the reason why that's not the best approach, because in her mind, she believes 1000% that her husband is sitting at home waiting for her. And if I had said to her, "Don't you remember Marty died 5 years ago?" It could be like she's hearing it for the very first time and then go into a panic. "What are you
Yeah.
talking about? Nobody told me. When did this happen?"
Yeah.
So you have to kind of wait for her short-term memory malfunction, if you will, to be restored. So she'll come back to the present time. When these types of things happen, their short-term memory switch kind of gets flipped off and they're pulling from their past memories. So no, she did not remember. She cannot remember that her husband passed away 5 years ago because in her reality, he's alive. He's home waiting and she needs to get to him. So there's a whole strategic way to approach these types of situations that come up on a daily basis.
Wow. So I don't want you to spoil the book, but I want to know how like how do you approach them like without telling them, "Hey, they passed away." Like what would you say? Like would you just be like, "Okay, we're going to go take you there," or
Well,
like
in that particular story, and it was me talking to this woman, and through the training and my education, my experience, I knew that the best approach was to do what we call join their reality. So I said to her, I said, "Oh no, don't worry about it, Marianne." She was my mother-in-law. I said, "Marty just called. He knows you're here. And he knows that you probably are worried about coming home and fixing him dinner, but he wanted me to tell you that he's watching a football game on TV. He's fine, and just stay as long as you want, and he'll see you when you get home." And she said, "Are you sure? Are you sure? Because I don't want him to be worried." I said, "I'm positive." And then she dropped the whole subject. We went back to doing what we were doing before this episode just kind of came out of nowhere.
wow. I
So
do
it's
have a
called
question.
join their reality is the
Oh.
is the approach that we take when people have these false beliefs. And the false beliefs come out of their short-term memories basically short circuiting for a given time, or think of it as a switch that gets flipped on and off. Because in the beginning of Alzheimer's disease, the short-term memory switch stays on most of the time. Then as the disease progresses, it's on half the time and it's off half the time. And then in the end stage, usually by the time people are ready to, or they get to the end stage, their short-term memories are gone completely. And they are living in a past period of their life, because the long-term memory stays intact for the duration of the disease, or most of it anyway. And so when the short-term memory just stops functioning altogether, they pull from their past memories. And that's when they end up talking about things that they believe are actually occurring right then and there, but they're actually talking about things from their past, because that's where their mind is gone.
Wow. So is this hereditary? Hereditary? Like, can I get it from my family members getting it? Like I can?
Well, it's not really. There is one form of Alzheimer's disease that is genetic, and people carry a gene for it, and it runs in families, and it's called early onset Alzheimer's disease. And it's a rarer form of Alzheimer's disease that people develop when they're under 65.
Oh.
Now, the normal or the standard form of Alzheimer's disease runs in families. But it doesn't necessarily mean that just because, now I've mentioned before, I have 5 family members, blood relatives, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to get it, but my risk factor is higher for getting it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Man, I'm gonna have to look into my family history and make sure, and but yeah, wow. So I do have another question. So you said it turns on and off, like, is it ever stay on? Like, are they always, like, is there some people that's always like that every day?
There are. It varies from person to person. And in the beginning stages of the disease, their short-term memory is functioning pretty normally. And then as they progress through the disease and it worsens, then the best way to kind of know if that switch is on or that switch is off is to listen for the cues. And you'd be able to tell if it's all of a sudden been flipped off by what they're talking about. So I was having a normal conversation with Marianne, and then out of nowhere, she starts talking about her deceased husband. Well, I knew that switch went off, and now she's pulling from her past memories, her long-term memories, because she's talking about something that makes absolutely no sense to me. I know the man's deceased, but this is the difference. It makes perfect sense to her, because now this becomes her true reality. She believes this, and there's nothing anybody can say or do to change her mind. And all you can do is hope that switch gets flipped back on. And with some people, it's stays on for stays off for a very short period of time, and others it can go on for a longer period of time. But you can pick up if it's on or off based on what they're talking about.
Right. Wow.
And then you know whether or not you need to join their reality, or if they start talking about things that align with both of your realities, that make sense to both of you, then you know that she's back, he's back, and you can go on with a normal conversation. But yeah, so it's you can detect it pretty easily when they start talking about things that make absolutely no sense to you, because they don't match your reality, but they match her reality or his reality.
I love this conversation because I'm learning so much now, like learning a lot.
I'll give you another example. My mother-in-law, I could tell when her short-term memory switch got flipped off, because the period of her life that she regressed back to, that she, from her long-term memory, she was always talking about the same period of her life. And she was a teenager, about 12, 13, 14 years old, and she would play doubles tennis with her brother.
Wow.
Now, my husband is one of her sons. And when that short-term memory switch flipped off, she was either thinking about where her husband was, who had been deceased for years, or playing tennis with her brother. She didn't recognize my husband because she hadn't gotten married yet and had a child, had 5 kids. So she knew him some way. So she would call him Otto, her brother. Hey, let's go, beat those guys at tennis. Because that period of life that she was living in that moment, she was only 14 years old.
Wow.
She had a brother named Otto, but she certainly didn't have a son at that time in her life. So we always knew when she was back there, because she would start calling my husband Otto instead of his name and talking about beating these opponents at tennis. You knew that she was back in a different period of time in her life.
Wow. Wow, that's pretty wow. I don't know what else to say. Wow.
It's
So
pretty fascinating. And a lot of people, I like to talk about these things because I want to raise the awareness to people that these are the things that come up. They're unpredictable, they're unexpected, but they're not impossible to deal with. And keep it from escalating to a more serious situation, like somebody getting really upset, or you telling somebody that their husband's has passed away, and freaking them out. So this is what I do as a behavioral specialist, is I teach people how to navigate the waters of caring for somebody or having a relative or a friend who's living with dementia.
Yeah, I love it that you're helping people, because people like me and the younger people, like, we don't understand. So we just, like, some of us won't even deal with it. But I feel like this will help my listeners understand, so that they can communicate better with their relatives who are going through it, and so they won't avoid them,
Well, I think one of the things that's really important to know and understand is, just in the United States right now, according to the Alzheimer's Association, there are over 6 million people living with just Alzheimer's disease. That's not the other diseases that cause dementia. That's just Alzheimer's disease. Their projection for the number of people who will develop Alzheimer's disease just in the next 25 years, that number is going to more than double.
What?
Yes. So families are going to be impacted by this disease. The numbers are just going to increase unbelievably. And around the world, there's going to be over 100 million people living with Alzheimer's disease around the world. So this is going to be a big deal for a lot of families. And to have this, to be equipped with these tools in your tool belt, to know how to respond to your grandma who's talking about your grandfather that's not alive anymore, you will know, oh yeah, join her reality. That's what you're supposed to do. There's a lot of tricks to the trade, a lot of them, techniques and things like that, that would be very helpful in being able to just have the best relationship you can with that loved one or the person you're caring for who has dementia, without always having it feel stressful and awkward and uncomfortable and combative, and you get in arguments because you're trying to tell them that something's not the way they're saying it is, and they're not going to believe you. So there's a way around this to enjoy your relationship with your loved one.
That's true. That's true. I did want to ask you one more question before I let you go, about your book, True Lies in Alzheimer's. Can you tell us a little bit about that one? And you said it's new, right? It's recently coming out?
No, it's not even available yet, but it'll be out probably in the next 30 days, maybe, if everything goes right. And this one, I'm actually going to have a workbook accompany that book and offer a training course to be able to teach people everything we've talked about today. So that will be available in the next, let's say, 30 to 60 days. Truth Lies and Alzheimer's, its secret faces. And one of the reasons why I called it Its Secret Faces is because of all these things that kind of come up out of nowhere. People need to know what these secret faces are, because they come up on a daily basis. And the first thing to do is to recognize it as being part of the disease. And then the second thing is to understand how to approach it so you continue a smooth relationship and don't, stir the pot, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. Ooh, I can't wait for this one to come out. But I want to thank you so much, Lisa, for coming on my podcast today and chatting with me.
I want to thank you again for having me and for sharing this information with your wonderful listeners. And I hope everybody learned something valuable today.
Yeah, it was very educational. I really loved this interview. I really did.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.